Spirit of God, we pray that you move in and through these words and in and through our minds and hearts, so that we might hear that your gospel is one of abundance and not one of scarcity. Then enable us to embody that in all the work of our lives. To this end, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of each one of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, who is our rock and our redeemer. Amen. We are in the 6th chapter of the Gospel of John, and I'll be reading verses 1 through 21. Let us listen for what the Spirit may be speaking to the church. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up to the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw the large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not be enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place. They sat down, about 5,000 in all. And then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were all satisfied, Jesus told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that Jesus had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When the evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea began to become rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus standing on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But Jesus said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. It is clear that we know that there is only really one miracle story that exists in all 4 Gospels. They share some of them, but the only one that is shared in all 4 is the feeding stories. So central are they to the life of faith, rooted in a grand tradition of feeding, not just because we like to eat together, but because it began with the manna story in the wilderness. Bread for those who were hungry, enough for everyone to eat. No one could hoard, and no one went hungry. All had what they needed. In the wilderness, too, the prophet Elijah made sure that a widow and her son had food, even though they believed they were going to die. Miracle in the wilderness, food enough for those who had been forgotten. And so Jesus picks up this grand tradition on the Passover and feeds again here in the Gospel of John. At the heart of these stories is not that bread is a good thing and we ought to eat it. It is, and we should. It's not just to tell us that we're supposed to eat together as people of faith, but we are. It is not just a precursor to communion, but it is to inform our communion practice. No, at the heart of this is a competing narrative. Every time these feeding stories come up, they're always in opposition to something else. In Egypt, it was the empire. The empire that said, we cannot trust immigrants and we cannot feed the poor. God says, watch me. When King Ahab believed that there was not enough to go around and hoarded it all for himself, the prophet Elijah says God has a different story. There is enough to go around, but not if you're hoarding it. So too in the Roman Empire, as they used food as a weapon throughout the history of the empire. Jesus comes along and provides food. And so at the heart of these feeding stories is the simple truth that the belief that there's not enough to go around is a lie. There is not enough to go around. We hear this all the time. We don't have enough money. We don't have enough time. We don't have enough energy. We don't have enough. No one ever bothers to ask the question, what is in fact enough? But we're not to blame. This is not to beat us up and say, well, we just have to stop believing there's not enough. Because our entire economic system is based on a simple fact that there is not enough. Scarcity is at the heart of our economic system. Some people will have less, some people will have more, some people will starve. Some people will own $50 million jets. Some people will eat gold on their food, while others struggle for today's meal. But that's just the way it is. There's nothing we can do about it. And then it becomes a zero-sum game. If you have more, then I'm going to have less, so I'm going to get mine. This idea of scarcity really is, in our society, a theological foundation that we pretend that it's not. In all that we do, we struggle to make ends. We cling to this idea that there's not enough, and then couple it with the idea that there's nothing we can do about it because it is just the way of the world. There was a time where this was not the case. But in the face of scarcity, or what we really ought to call simply a misallocation of God's abundant resources, we have restaurants that throw food in dumpsters and spray it with ammonia so hungry people can't steal it because they've thrown it out. Our troubles are because we have not allocated resources in the way that God intends. Written into the feeding stories is an economic reality that there is enough to go around, and there should be. For people of faith, I'm not an economist, but I am a follower of Jesus who has heard these stories. And that means we must speak. Now, I know that there is an end to all the resources we have in the world. There is written into our lives and our being and our world an end. There is not enough if we allow greed to run rampant. But as an article of faith in our society, we cannot resign ourselves to believing it has the last word. If people are without housing, if people are without health care, if people are without food or work that pays a living wage, we cannot stand and allow those who claim scarcity has the last word to have the last word. We are people of bread, and more bread than we imagine. So in the face of scarcity, we're called to call it a lie. When the claim is made, there is not enough to go around. When there is not enough for social welfare. But we are on the precipice of having two almost trillion-dollar companies who don't pay their fair share of taxes and make sure they don't have to. We have to something isn't right, something is broken. This is not the way God intended. It is at its heart sin. That's the message. But the good news is that we are not the first people to struggle with this. That is one of the reasons why I really like the way John tells this feeding story. Because at the end, it is a miracle. Sometimes we talk about the miracle being the sharing of what people brought. But here, it's very clear from the crowds, from the story, John wants us to know that this is God's doing in this place so that we remember the manna story. So that we remember the story of Elijah, so that we know that God is still at work, saying no to the powers of scarcity and death. Disciples in all ages have struggled with this, though, and that is why I appreciate Andrew and Philip. The first followers of Jesus were too also trapped by this myth of scarcity. When faced with the struggling of the world, when the need at their doorstep, the disciples respond saying, we don't have enough money to feed all these people. Even if we work for 6 months, there won't be enough. And all he can see is scarcity. And we know that that's what Jesus is trying to get at because he sets him up. Like a good teacher, asking a question that you know the answer to, and you know the student might not quite get it right. But this is an opportunity for learning. And he is left with there is not enough. But even Andrew, notice Andrew, says, look, we've got some over here. There's a little boy who's never named, but he has 5 loaves and 2 fish. And guess what? He's willing to give it. What he has, he's willing to give. But Andrew, too, is trapped by the myth of scarcity, saying, even if we use all of this and everybody gets a tiny little piece like we do in communion, nobody's going to be full. But they had a willingness to try. Their willingness was to start with what they had, even if it wasn't enough. But that's the rub. It's not even theirs. The disciples are willing to use what they have, but it wasn't theirs anyway. It was that little boy's, and possibly his family. Because he didn't come out in the wilderness by himself. The little child shall lead them. And probably embarrass them first because he was willing to give up all he had. And then the disciples think, well, that's just not going to be enough, so there's nothing to do. Did you catch that? Jesus says, all right, sit him down. I'll show you what's going on. What they have to use for the work of ministry wasn't even theirs to begin with, and it wasn't ours. Here's the thing, the life of faith that we have never is ours anyway, because somewhere along the line, someone shared with you the love of God in Jesus Christ. It didn't happen without someone else. It could have been a teacher, a family member, someone you knew in church. Somewhere along the lines, you learned in word and in deed that there was enough to go around. The love of God in Christ. The churches that we live in, the churches that we were raised in, we didn't build. And even if we did build them, if we're a new church development with a building, it wasn't all of our money, it was part of it. You can't build a church building by yourself unless you're a Rockefeller. But then again, that's a different sermon for a different. And while we contribute to the work, right, the disciples, even though that wasn't their food to share, they took what was given to them, handed it to Jesus, and then they got to work of organizing people to sit down and be prepared to be fed. Almost all that we have, and almost all that all the churches have, are a gift from the past, a gift from someone else. It's almost as if we're a living reminder that the scarcity that we live in and we breathe and we internalize and sometimes believe is meant to be challenged from an early age. And it is this child. I wish we had this child's name, but we don't. But this child was willing to give up so that everyone might have enough, even though he knew his little bit wasn't going to solve all of the problems, he gave anyway. And the result is that Jesus took that simple offering and multiplied it in ways that the disciples couldn't even imagine, let alone that child. Or maybe the child could. It is as we get older that we believe nothing will change. And in the end, all are satisfied. That's a fantastic word there. It's to let us know that they weren't just taking a little nib off of the loaf of bread. These people were eating and satisfied on bread and fish, the multitudes. And when it's over, there are 12 baskets. They started with a basket of bread and fish and end with 12. More than they ever imagined. When folks began ministries, when folks gather together to worship or to try new things, they never know exactly what it's going to look like. But they give of themselves, and sometimes they're amazed at what comes from that simple seed, or bread and fish in this case. And then they learn here in this story about abundance. But written into this story of God's abundance is also a lesson in good stewardship. When he says, go and get the leftovers, he doesn't say, let's go show off how much there is left over. What he says is, so that it is not wasted. Not just thrown away, but so that it could be used for others who are hungry. There's a whole stewardship sermon in there, I know. We're not going to do that today. But you have to notice that this extravagant abundance of God is not wasted. But it breaks down this myth of scarcity and then makes sure all are satisfied and that there will be bread for tomorrow. That's powerful. So powerful that you might have heard this story before. I think I might have shared it. There was an orphanage at the end of World War II, and they had children who were there whose parents had died during the war. And they struggled to get these children to go to sleep. They would not sleep. And finally, they figured out if they gave each one of the kids a loaf of bread to sleep with, they would go to sleep. Why? Because they had scavenged so long in the war, in the devastation, that they were terrified that there would not be bread for tomorrow. And if they had bread, and everyone had bread, then they could sleep. And here in this story, there is bread for tomorrow, for the disciples and the followers and those who are hungry. There is bread for tomorrow. Do not believe the ways of scarcity. And in this lesson, it is if you have more than you really need, use it. Truth, there will be hunger. There will be times of need. There will be ministry to do in Jesus' name, more than we could ever engage with. But we are called to share nonetheless, to give of ourselves nonetheless. We need to share it with others. And what it shows, I believe, in this passage more than anything is if we are able to give up the myth of scarcity that infects all of our lives, if we're willing to start with what we have instead of complain about what we don't, if we're willing to imagine that another world is possible instead of complaining with what all is wrong, and I'm really guilty on both fronts. That's for those who are asleep. Sorry about that. If we can do that, we will imagine and then bring into making a difference in the world. Each one of us has the ability. Just like that one child, he had no idea what would come from his simple gift and the way people would be fed, not just then, but even for tomorrow. And the truth is, sometimes it will be earth-shattering when we make a difference in the world, but most of the time, it will be something simple. We may not even see the fruit of our labor. This week we saw an example, some of you might have seen, about one person deciding that she could make a difference in the world in another person's life. I'll probably mispronounce her name, but it's Ellen Eriksson. She's a Swedish student. Swedish student who was on her way to fly, and on that plane was an asylum seeker who was being sent back to Afghanistan. She had seen in her own country the rising hatred for immigrants. And as we see that in our own time, it can leave us wondering, what can we do in the face of this? Complain, retweet, challenge what's going on, call our representatives. But in that moment, Ellen decided she could do even more. She had more power than she even imagined. And so she used what she had, which was her body. She became aware of the immigrant and the asylum seeker and knew that he was being deported to Afghanistan. And if he was to make it back to Afghanistan, she had learned that he most likely would be killed. And so what she did was refuse to sit down. She refused to sit down so the plane couldn't take off. The law is really clear. Y'all have to be in your seats with your buckles on before this plane can take off, and she refused. And then she took out her phone and she started taping what was happening. And as she did, a few of the passengers began to argue, "Sit down, we want to get somewhere." And she said, "But this man's life is on the line. I'm not going to sit down." One of them tried to steal her phone, but one of the stewardesses took that phone back and handed it back to her. And then all of a sudden something started to happen. People began to hear why she was standing up. And then they started to support her. And guess what happened? That man was able to get off the plane. That man's life was spared, at least on that day. And then she posted that, so that all could see that we never know when we have the opportunity to save another person's life, or to make a difference, or to say no to the powers of death and scarcity in our world. So we can tell her story about the ways we can overcome this. One person doing what she could do with what she had led to a man's life being saved on that day. We can all of us, do something to make the world a better place. It may not be standing up on a plane, it might be. It might be smaller. It might not be taped and shown to the world, but it is important nevertheless. But until we recognize that each one of us does have something, some loaf of bread, some piece of fish, to offer to the world, until we know that that is true in each one of us. When we know that, then we will be able to use our gifts accordingly, to be part of building the beloved community. Because the simple truth is, the world needs your gifts. The world needs your uniqueness. The world needs what God has given you to bring life and hope for others. So don't keep them to yourself. Give in love. And I believe the story tells us that God will do the rest. Amen.